When you're ready, gentlemen, if you can please state your names and who you're appearing on behalf of. Thank you.
David Close from Origin Energy.
Cote, Origin Energy.
Thank you. Yes, when you're ready.
Thank you very much, Justice Pepper and panel, for the opportunity to present this morning following the release of the draft final report. We'd like to acknowledge the thoroughness of the draft final report and the clear position taken by the panel on a wide range of issues. Many of the recommendations in the report align with Origin's approach to development, including stakeholder engagement, cultural heritage protection, environmental monitoring and project execution. In our recent submission to the draft final report, we have not sought to comment on all recommendations. Where we have not commented, we either accept the recommendation in principle or we consider it's possibly not helpful to comment until there is further policy detail as to how legislation to give effect to the recommendations, if they're ultimately accepted, may be enacted. These recommendations that will require a more detailed understanding of policy proposal and operating environments will need careful consideration at the time to be effective. Where we have made responses to specific recommendations, it's typically where we consider the level of prescription exceeds the level of knowledge we currently have as to the issues that may be faced and the details of any risks. We look forward to the opportunity to contribute positively to a robust collaborative reform process to ensure fit-for-purpose, objective-based legislation that enables the responsible development of onshore gas in the Northern Territory. Today, Alex and I will speak to 4 specific and distinct yet related subjects: regulatory reform, aquifer protection and well-design principles, strategic assessments and land access and insurance once more. So firstly, to regulatory reform. We note that the highest number of recommendations in the final report, draft final report, are in Chapter 14 on regulatory reform. Origin certainly supports a rigorous and comprehensive regulatory and legislative framework for the Northern Territory in preparation for the potential onshore gas industry expansion. And much of this reform potentially will be to legislate what is currently in regulation, and in many instances we posit that it's therefore accepted industry practices and would be very appropriate to be legislated. While the process is underway, which is likely to take a number of years, it's critical that existing legislation and regulation remain in force to allow the review process to be thorough and comprehensive without causing undue delays to the exploration and appraisal activities and baseline studies that are going to be needed to inform the potential for a viable onshore gas industry in the Northern Territory. We support the panel's recommendation that legislative reform should be mature prior to the final approval of any large-scale onshore gas development in the Northern Territory. However, we consider that it's not necessary for the reform process to be final and complete prior to the granting of approvals for small-scale exploration and piloting, or the approval of a production licence, which in itself is simply a permit instrument and grants no authority to undertake development activity. We've suggested in our written submission several instances of the term production licence be replaced by something to the effect of authority to develop and produce, to remove any ambiguity between permit management, tenure types and activity approvals.
No ambiguity.
But moving away from the tactical detail to some of what we think are important objectives of the legislative reform, be to ensure that assessments of developments or activity with a potential to impact the environment are comprehensive, rigorous and risk-based, but don't involve unnecessary duplication and do ensure really clear accountability. And the assessment process is efficient to ensure productivity is maximised by all parties. During the reform, careful consideration will be required regarding the continuous and ongoing responsibility of states and what may be covered under Commonwealth legislation. This will be particularly relevant to water management and provisions that could become mandatory, whether appropriate or not, if the EPBC water trigger is mandated for all unconventional gas projects. Equally, the objectives and requirements of a SREBA type process will need to be designed to complement rather than partially replace or duplicate existing requirements such as comprehensive Northern Territory EIS requirements or Commonwealth EPBC requirements. And once there is more detail about how we'll implement SREBA, we'd be very keen to have the chance to look into that further. Critical elements that are designed to prevent adverse environmental impacts should be applied to all industries and not selectively in our view. Applying them selectively will not achieve the objective of being holistic and inclusive of cumulative impacts, and we think that applies broadly to a number of recommendations that we entirely support and agree with, but if applied purely to the onshore gas industry, will not achieve their effect of understanding potential cumulative impacts that multiple industries could introduce into an area. Specifically in relation to recommendation 14.32 of the draft final report regarding the option 1 or option 2 that is detailed in the report, we make the following observations. That both options provide positives and come with different types of risks that will need to be managed. Of the framework options described, we see the most positives in aspects of option 2 that would create some kind of one-stop shop approach. Although we suggest that the regulator must be responsible for all petroleum operations and development, not only unconventional operations for practical reasons.
But you realise our terms of reference are strictly directed towards onshore shale.
Right, so that'll prevent making
Correct.
a broader recommendation.
Correct.
Okay.
Which is why we've been very careful in our terminology.
Okay.
There's
So in
probably
due
no
course-
necessary, there would be no, I'm sure, disagreement, and I'm sorry to butt in, and
No,
it's,
no, of course.
I think, one of the rare times that I've done so, but I just, in case you go down a tangent, there'd be, I think, no disagreement here from this panel that obviously would be ideal
Okay.
if the government looked more broadly at all extractive industries, but our terms of reference limit us strictly to onshore shale.
Okay, well, that is helpful context and a good reminder. So I think that's probably a given in due course during legislative reform, that last point then. One point regarding the characteristics and key competencies of a proposed regulatory reform agency, which already stipulate to water, environment and geology as well it should. There is a bit of a lack of recognition of petroleum operation disciplines such as drilling and completions, production operations, instrumentation and facilities engineering and process safety that we think perhaps could be more clearly articulated, and what the lack of sort of recognition at this point does highlight a potential issue with dual regulators, which option 1 might provide for, where either both regulators must sustain expertise in these areas, or the legislation must attempt to create a seamless handoff at some accountability boundary, which can be difficult to implement, we know. So we recognise we recognise why you put 2 options in there, and we can see positives in both, but that broad skill set is one that we recognise as a potential gap. One other point regarding the appropriateness of either of the options and the regulation is that, quoting here, the extreme remoteness of many sites and the dispersed nature of unconventional operations will create increased risk on the regulatory framework. We would contend that large conventional fields, for example, the Cooper Basin, the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin, face very similar geographic challenges and are remote, large and dispersed, similar to what potentially a Northern Territory, depending on where it was in the Northern Territory, could be, and that the regulators in those jurisdictions are effectively ensuring compliance, a small point. Both options, importantly, both options discussed in the draft final report allow for an objective-based approach to regulation, which we believe will lead to the best overall outcomes. However, as Origin has previously submitted, we do accept that prescriptive minima may be appropriate in certain circumstances, but in general, prescriptive legislative requirements are very unlikely to be optimal across the entirety of the Northern Territory with such a range of physical geographies, geological variations and climate patterns. And for example, a few examples of this, enclosed water tanks for storage may not be appropriate for all environments all the time, and therefore we consider shouldn't be mandated. Alex will talk in a bit more detail to this. Pad spacing prescription, particularly when defined on a linear rather than area basis, could potentially decrease overall efficiency of a development and require a greater overall footprint. If minimum spacing is prescribed, an area-based approach, which we presume, and there's a presumption that it would achieve the same objectives of the panel, is preferred as it recognises the asymmetry of pad spacing associated with the fact that wells are drilled bidirectionally off a pad. Finally, on prescription, the requirement for all environmental baseline and monitoring data to be made public in real time, we consider overly prescriptive. But in stating that, we do accept and support transparency in reporting as an objective principle. What we would suggest is that appropriate disclosure and reporting should be fit for purpose for the project, environment, potential receptors and data type, and specifically to ensure quality and easily interpretable results Regular reporting is likely to have higher public benefit than a continuous stream of data that has not had any quality assurance or interpretation. We do accept that a requirement for independent audit or to make sure the full raw data are available by request might be required to ensure probity of data collection and reporting. But in terms of interpretability and use by the public, regular reporting of high quality is preferable to a continuous stream of digits that are pretty difficult to interpret for most people in the public domain. Under the current largely objective-based Act, basin-based directives can be introduced as required, and this could assist with a swift implementation of selected recommendations to allow activity to recommence if the current moratorium is lifted following this scientific inquiry. By continuing exploration and appraisal activities under the current Act, operators and the Northern Territory Government can continue to acquire baseline environmental and geological data as envisaged in the draft final report. These data will be critical to ensure development projects, if ultimately proved viable through exploration, appraisal and piloting, can be progressed responsibly and without undue timing pressure on environmental studies and approvals. So we would like to keep going with the activities we were proposing. A little bit more on timing, which we've touched on a couple of times. We wanted to comment on the timing of regulatory reform, project progression and estimating time to project ramp up if it is successful in the exploration phase, and where the approval of production licence falls in that process, and some comments that relate back to section 14.3 and the flow chart in the draft final report. The flow chart omits a sufficiently substantial number of key steps that we thought would comment on it to give a bit more basis to why it will take such an amount of time after a production licence being granted before any serious activity would commence. So once the PL is, we're currently in the ENA phase, as we've spoken about, and the activity that's currently proposed is exploration appraisal activity. It will take a number of years of that type of activity to inform an optimal piloting strategy, which will also likely be multi-year. At some point during the exploration appraisal or piloting phase, it's likely that the exploration permits that we operators currently hold will transition to either a retention licence, which come with certain tenure conditions, or a production licence if sufficient confidence can be justified to the regulator. And if you do get a retention licence and want to proceed at some point in the future, it transitions to a production licence on application. Once a PL, production licence, is confirmed, there are still many key steps, each which likely take multiple years to conclude, but some of which can be progressed in parallel. And some of these activities, substantive activities, include detailed field development planning, detailed project planning and costing, pre-front-end engineering and design, i.e. pre-FEED, and then FEED work. That's critical. Then would also be negotiation of production agreements with traditional owners, negotiation of compensation and access agreements with pastoral lessees, heads of agreement and ultimately gas sales agreements with pipeline companies and gas buyers. That would be critical commercial negotiations that would likely be very substantive. Environmental impact assessments, including any necessary EPBC referrals, social impact assessments, all of which, if successfully completed, support a final investment decision, which would then be followed by contract tendering, review and award, which would likely be a substantial amount of time for the project ramp up. Ultimately, final regulatory approval and outline of conditions once all of those pieces of the puzzle are in place. So then substantial on-the-ground activity could occur. So at least, and it's difficult to predict, but we would say at least 3 to 7 years after the grant of a PL, in almost all realistic scenarios, before you would be ramping to what we would consider a large-scale development activity as per our previous submissions. So I think the point of this partly is, again, relating back to production licences, which can occur and be granted quite early in a project life. They're part of the Northern Territory tenure management system rather than some kind of final project sanction. And that needs not be linked to regulatory reform timing. Just continuing on the regulatory reform and compliance piece, in addition to the extensive discussion of potential future models of regulation in the draft final report, there's also an extensive discussion regarding the schedule as a regulatory tool and also industry compliance with regulations. Excuse me. For example, a quote from section 14.3, the schedule has been described as an ineffective regulatory tool. I would like to talk through the process of the approval of the NWIH hydraulic fracture stimulation in 2016 to both show Origin's compliance, but also illustrate that the existing Act, schedule and other regulatory guidelines provide for a comprehensive approval process for individual or small-scale activities. In section 14.7 of the draft final report, the following is stated: but the requirements of the Petroleum Environment Regulations can be readily circumvented by gas companies. An example of this was Origin's Mungee NW1H well. So as I read the draft final report and sort of soaked in that, really found it a bit confronting, frankly, because the above statement suggests that Origin attempted to circumvent relevant regulations in its application. I can personally attest that this is categorically not the case. At no point did we ever discuss or ever intentionally or even ever consider that we were circumventing any regulations, and I'll go a bit further into detail and provided some more detail in our written submission. Origin was formally advised by the CEO of the Department of Mines and Energy, directly to our Managing Director in Sydney, so straight to the top of our corporate structure, that existing environmental management plans, or EMPs, were to be, such as Origin's EMP for the hydraulic fracture stimulation, which was submitted substantially before those regulations were introduced in July 2016, would be considered current plans as far as the new regulations were concerned, and there would be a window up until December 1st of 2017 under which current plans will continue to be valid, such to provide a time to transition to the new regulations. And we from the date of that letter had confirmation that all applications would be assessed against the current regulations, and we're very clear on that and continue down that path. It is worth noting that we voluntarily, or at the request of the DME, provided the information required to bridge the gap between the pre-existing and updated regulations, primarily providing full disclosure of all additives in the stimulation fluids and providing a summary EMP for public release on the DME website. We had absolutely no issue complying with those changes, even though obviously it was a somewhat voluntary process because the old regulations didn't require it. The timeline of approval under the current Act and regulations demonstrates that it's very difficult to change regulatory requirements overnight. Of course, if there's some reason they're manifestly unsound and for safety reasons you would expect overnight compliance with change. But in this instance, where it was mostly around reporting and changes of approach, we considered that it was very normal to continue under the EMP that we had been drafting and finalising for some months, rather than immediately, in the space of a day, in the middle of an operation, to transition to some different regulatory requirement. It was not because the previous ones were manifestly unsound for safety or environment reasons. The process of approval for the hydraulic fracture simulation ran for many months before the final approval, and it should be noted drilling of the well was approved and executed the previous calendar year, so it was a multi-year process in totality. External approvals required review by the Department of Mines and Energy at the time, other territory government departments and the Environmental Protection Agency. And this, of course, is all additional to the extensive internal reviews and assurance that is undertaken by Origin as a matter of course. I would point out that the final approval was also conditional on a successful pressure test, which was reviewed by the department prior to the final approval. So even at that final step, there is, if your pressure test exceeds these requirements, then you have met the conditions to proceed with the activity. Now, we do recognise the broader intent of this section of the draft final report was to point out that the current Act allows the Minister's discretion to be applied broadly, and that could erode public confidence in the regulator and its processes. However, we believe this point can be made without impugning Origin's reputation, and would respectfully request that the suggestion Origin circumvented regulation is reconsidered in the panel's final report. With that, I'll pass to Alex, who's going to talk a bit further about drilling codes of practice and specifically Category 9 wells in the draft final report.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you for allowing me to speak today. I would like to discuss Recommendation 5.3. Recommendation 5.3 reads that in consultation with industry and other stakeholders, the government develop and mandate an enforceable code of practice setting out the minimum requirements that must be met to ensure the integrity of onshore shale gas wells in the NT. This code must require that all onshore shale gas wells, including exploration wells constructed for the purpose of production testing, be constructed to at least a Category 9 or equivalent standard, with cementing extending up to at least the shallowest problematic hydrocarbon-bearing organic carbon-rich or saline aquifer zone. Firstly, let me say that Origin supports a code of practice, setting out minimum objective-based well design standards. As noted by Origin and reiterated by the panel in the draft final report, the most effective way to ensure this objective is to require that the surface casing is set below the aquifer and that the top of cement is above the shallowest hydrocarbon-bearing zone. Origin, in principle, would support the development of a code of practice that would ensure such risk mitigating well design requirements are in place for all new oil and gas wells. Origin does not agree with the panel's recommendation that all future shale gas wells be designed to a Category 9 standard. This is overly prescriptive, and requiring an individual standard across all wells may not be appropriate for all targets in all basins. The aspect of this recommendation that Origin does not agree with is the fact that Category 9 wells need to be constructed with an intermediate casing string. The need for an intermediate casing string for the Beetaloo wells is not driven by well integrity considerations, such as preventing fluid migration. The need for an intermediate casing string is driven by safety and operational factors during the drilling phase. The most important consideration is ensuring a sufficient kick tolerance. Secondary considerations include ensuring adequate hole stability, minimizing differential sticking, and addressing directional drilling concerns. The Beetaloo wells drilled by Origin required an intermediate casing string due to our own internal well construction requirements, specifically around the need to maintain an adequate kick tolerance for each well based on the respective target depths and predicted formation properties. Although Origin's exploration wells to date in the Beetaloo have met the Category 9 definition, it is possible that other targets, such as the Kaala Formation, could be effectively drilled and fracture stimulated with a different casing configuration, while still maintaining redundant barriers and meeting Origin's internal drilling and completion standards. David has given several examples of how prescriptive and objective-based risk mitigating frameworks may lead to different outcomes in his earlier section. I'll provide an additional example of where I believe an objective-based framework would result in a more optimal result than a prescriptive one would have. As stated several times, all of Origin's wells drilled in the Beetaloo, Kalala S1, Amungi Northwest 1, and 1H, and Beetaloo West 1 meet the Category 9 well requirements outlined in the draft final report. Prior to drilling these wells, and as part of Origin's groundwater risk assessment, Origin considered the risk of crossflow between two shallow, potable aquifers across the permits. This risk was reviewed in detail as the NT objective-based regulations prohibit aquifer crossflow regardless of environmental consequence. This particular portion of the risk assessment has drawn media attention of late and has been interpreted as Origin willingly accepting the risk of aquifer crossflow between shallow potable and deep saline aquifers. This is not true. Firstly, the risk was concerned with the crossflow between shallow potable aquifers. Secondly, this risk only exists in certain areas within the Beetaloo Basin. Lastly, the risk matrix that was commented upon by the media reflects the risk without the implementation of the final controls employed at Beetaloo West 1. The risk of aquifer crossflow between shallow potable aquifers is only present in the southern portion of Origin's permits. As such, the well design used at Kalala and Amungi did not account for this risk. Had the same well design been used at Beetaloo West 1, there would have been a risk of crossflow between the freshwater Cambrian and the freshwater Cretaceous aquifers. To mitigate and ultimately eliminate this risk, at Beetaloo West 1, casing well drilling was employed, which allowed the constant setting of casing while drilling and sustained annular pressure, preventing crossflow between aquifers. A standardized prescriptive Category 9 well may not have addressed this risk properly. As aforementioned, all wells were designed to Category 9 standards, but only the Beetaloo West 1 well design managed to eliminate the risk at hand. This is another example of how objective-based regulations will allow operators and regulators to better address regional and area-specific risks, and we will submit further documentation to this extent. To summarize, a code of practice that sets out minimum requirements to ensure the integrity of onshore wells in the Northern Territory, whether they are targeting unconventional or conventional reservoirs, that include a level of prescription regarding casing and cement placement in relation to aquifers and hydrocarbon zones is supported. However, requiring all wells to be of Category 9 and therefore have an intermediate casing string is not. I will now move to some of the integrity testing considerations that were discussed in 5.1. Origin also supports the requirement of integrity testing prior to hydraulic fracture stimulation through pressure testing and CBLs, cement bond logs. Origin believes that the focus of this recommendation should be on the confirmation of integrity at high pressures prior to hydraulic fracture stimulation. Once the well is on production, so that is post-hydraulic fracturing, operating pressures are much lower, and the best diagnostic tool for a loss of integrity is constant surveillance, not discrete testing. Therefore, the focus should be on monitoring casing annuli pressures to ensure that firstly, there is no methane or pressure where it is not expected by design, and secondly, that all required maintenance is completed to design and schedule. This process of monitoring and surveillance is continuous and allows for the rapid response to any issue with well integrity and complements the requirements to undertake wellhead and component maintenance and integrity testing. This is something Origin already does on our Beetaloo wells as part of our internal well integrity management system. I will now discuss a few things in relation to water management. Firstly, again, Origin supports the majority of the recommendations regarding water usage and water monitoring presented in the draft final report. There are 2 points that I would like to discuss with you in relation to water management. The first is regarding water allocation, and the second is around the requirement for enclosed tanks. As the panel notes on page 326 of the draft final report, it is forecast that even in a high activity scenario, such as Aso Allen's Gale scenario, the gas industry will be a minor user of water relative to other users in the Northern Territories. To ensure the panel's recommendation regarding a holistic understanding of aquifer recharge, water usage, and strategic water allocation plans are effective, we consider it critical that all water users are captured by the panel's recommendations. We suggest that WAPs must be pan-industry and not just include in scope the rate and volume of water extraction by gas companies. And that regarding make-good provisions, there is a greater clarity that only drawdown resulting from gas company extraction is a trigger for a gas company to trigger the make-good provisions on a gas company.
Again, I can only repeat what I said before, which is that where our terms of references limit
Yeah,
what we're looking
and
at.
Understood.
Okay.
As currently stated, any reduction in water level would be assumed to be in scope for a make-good provision, and again, understand the point that you just made. Origin also support the principle of transparency with regards to baseline and monitoring data availability as recommended by the panel. The monitoring program and monitoring wells within the program should be fit for purpose, site-specific, and designed in conjunction with the WAP and SREBA that will be required under the recommendations. There will likely be reporting requirements under the WAP and/or SREBA, and these would be preferred to prescriptions regarding real-time and publicly available, as there will likely be practical challenges to real-time streaming of large volumes of uninterpreted and uncollated data directly to the public. We therefore request the panel to maintain an objective or outcome-based focus for the monitoring recommendation. We also request that an appropriate offset distance is recommended rather than mandated, and again, this should be fit for purpose. For existing bores on pastoral stations, compensation for use of an existing bore or a request for a new bore should be agreed through the land access negotiations. Lastly, I would like to discuss recommendation 7.11, and in particular, the requirement for enclosed tanks to be used to hold all wastewater. Managing wastewater is fundamental to successful operations in any shale gas development, and Origin supports collaborating with stakeholders to holistically manage wastewater. This recommendation seems to be in part driven by what BHP is currently undertaking in the Permian Basin. Firstly, what is suitable for the Permian may not be the correct solution in the Beetaloo. Secondly, I wouldn't consider BHP's practices necessarily to be industry-leading and would refer the panel to the recent JPT issues for a more robust overview of industry-leading practices in the Permian Basin with regards to water management. We suggest it is premature to prescribe universal standards given the diversity of the environments, project phases, and site-specific requirements that operators could face across the Northern Territory in exploring or developing unconventional gas. Existing EIS processes, or the panel's proposed SREBA process, will provide fit-for-purpose and site-specific conditions that are appropriate to the operating environment. Specifically, to prescribe that all wastewater must be stored in enclosed tanks is, in our view, unnecessary and increases the risks elsewhere. At different project phases, evaporation may be the primary means of reducing the volume of wastewater that requires transport. The land transport of large volumes would engender different risks than the evaporation of wastewater from above ground. Double-lined ponds were used successfully by Origin at Amungi Northwest 1H and have been used successfully in similar environments across Australia and internationally. Much of the ability for companies to recycle large portions of flowback water is thanks to the successful construction of double-lined above-ground storage ponds, such as in areas like the Marcellus and the Montney. The risk of overtopping can be managed, and we concur with the panel's observations in the draft final report on page 139 that design must be based on the maximum probable precipitation event coupled with an appropriate wet season maximum operating level. The amount of freeboard required, a function of previous and forecast rainfall events, frequency, intensity, and duration, will be different in the Amadeus Basin relative to the Northern MacArthur Basin in the northeast of Arnhem Land, and therefore the risk profile will be different. Origin supports that for environmentally hazardous wastewater, double lining and constant monitoring of wastewater ponds is a reasonable prescriptive minimum, but proposes that the requirement for all tanks being enclosed is not a reasonable prescriptive minimum. Thank you very much, and I'll hand back to Dave.
Thanks, Alex. A couple of pretty brief sections to summarise with finally. First on strategic assessments, which relates partly to some of the previous discussions Alex has introduced. We certainly agree that strategic and regional assessments are important and clearly good practice based on experience in Australia over the last 5 or more years, and we support the principle of their implementation. Assessments such as a SREBA will be critical to informing many aspects of multiple recommendations in the draft final report, if ultimately accepted, particularly relating to water, but also reporting and broader environmental baseline data requirements. The detail of exactly how a SREBA will interact with existing environmental approvals and other EIS and or EPBC processes will be important to ensure the process is efficient and beneficial. And we also note that a SREBA may not be the most appropriate mechanism to complete all baseline assessments. Certainly regional industry-wide assessments are suited for many environmental aspects such as public health, groundwater and air quality. However, other aspects are likely to be more suited to targeted, localised assessments that will most likely be impacted through specific infrastructure placement decisions or factors that aren't necessarily regional, such as weeds, terrestrial ecology, surface water, fire risk. And so there may need to be a degree of differentiation between what is optimally assessed regionally and what is optimally assessed on a local proponent scale. In addition, we'd suggest a socio-economic assessment that will provide key data if it's localised to a notional project area and a more detailed project scope, and that's likely to be unavailable when a SREBA would be most beneficial early in a project. So there may be some differentiation again there. But again, we certainly support the overall principle and the idea of collaborating with all relevant stakeholders. And we suggest that for it to be most effective at scope is the key environmental aspects of groundwater, greenhouse gas, air quality and public health. And we think that such a program could be implemented effectively by an independent body with support of the government industry, and there's a lot to be worked out in the detail of such models. Moving briefly to land access and particularly insurance, as it does come up consistently as we've observed over the last 12 months. We'd like to make some brief comments on the land access section of the regulatory reform chapter in the draft final report. Recommendation 14.5 regarding a legislated land access framework is supported by Origin, and we've stated that previously. We're comfortable that we know that coexistence between pastoralists and the gas industry is possible. It's happening every day in our Queensland operations. Origin concurs that agreements should be appropriate for the phases of the project. It's likely that exploration appraisals exploration appraisal may require a separate agreement to development and production. Accept that principle. Origin has entered into land access agreements with all pastoral SCs in the Northern Territory where it's undertaken work as per the current DPIR regulation. In these agreements, Origin's public liability assurance is explicitly detailed. However, in addition, and what is not always or hasn't traditionally been in our compensation and that land access agreements, is that Origin also carries further third-party environmental insurance as well as comprehensive control of well insurance. These insurance provisions, which along with our contracted, i.e. the land access contract, commitments to compensate for any impacts or losses associated with activities, ensures landholders can be confident that Origin is comprehensively insured for any unforeseen event. This has been an issue repeated numerous times by opponents of industry, and therefore we wanted to take this opportunity to share publicly that Origin does hold environmental insurance for impacts that don't have a specific and clearly identifiable immediate cause. And there are, of course, insurance companies that have these policies and make these policies available to resource companies, and it may not have been stated on the record previously, so I'm very keen to make it very clear today. And we can provide more information if there's any specific information requested. We would request that the panel support the continuation of the existing regulatory process for land access agreements to be negotiated until such time as a comprehensive legislative review is completed that we presume will include land access legislation. The current regulations have worked successfully across the Northern Territory with operators and landholders, and there is no evidence to suggest it cannot continue successfully until legislation is updated. Without such a continuation, the critical data required from exploration appraisal and baseline studies won't be available. So in closing, we again commend the comprehensive nature of the draft final report and the research and consultations that underpin it. The report maps a potential pathway forward for the Northern Territory Government to establish the necessary framework for a responsible, well-regulated onshore gas industry if exploration and appraisal ultimately prove successful. We support the efforts to keep legislation and regulation objective-based to promote innovative ways of achieving ALARP impacts, and agree that in some instances prescriptive minimum standards are a necessary complement to such regulations. We look forward to the opportunity to contribute positively to a legislative reform process while continuing exploration and appraisal and baseline data acquisition in the Beetaloo Subbasin if the moratorium is lifted following the completion of this inquiry. And of course we do that in consultation with our host traditional owners and impacted landholders. Data from the exploration activities and baseline studies will inform a thorough assessment of environmental and social risks and allow preventative measures and mitigation planning to be developed. And for the benefits to the local traditional owners, pastoralists and broader Northern Territory communities to become clearer and be more clearly articulated than can be today in such an early project phase. Such activity will remain small scale for a number of years and can be successfully undertaken under the existing Act and regulatory regime. And ultimately, if a project is able to successfully proceed, then gas production from onshore Northern Territory could support Australia's domestic and export gas requirements and contribute to our decreasing reliance on more carbon-intensive fossil fuels as the Australian economy transitions to a low-carbon future supported by renewable energy, storage and responsibly developed natural gas. I'd like to thank you all for your time, and of course we're happy to take any questions the panel may have.
Thank you. Yes, I'll start this way and work my way down this time. Yes, Dr. Anderson.
Yeah, thanks very much for your presentations. I've got a couple of questions for Mr. Close. And the first one refers to the draft recommendation in our report about mandating a minimum distance between well pads. And of course the context of that is addressing public concerns about an industrialisation of the landscape, and I think you know where we're coming from. And so I've heard what you say about the importance of having objective-based versus prescriptive-based regulation, and I see where you're coming from there. The problem here, though, is when the objective is so highly subjective, which is amenity use, as we talk about in the report, it makes it really difficult to not think about having some sort of prescription. And you said both in your written report and today about if there were some prescription, you'd prefer a sort of an area-based approach rather than a distance-based approach. And so I've got a couple of questions related to that. And one is, so we've put out a figure of 2 kilometres. Can you, and you talk about how that might unduly interfere with operations if there's some sort of geological anomaly or something like that.
Yeah.
Could you give us some examples of how that might play out, given that wells, you can have wells coming from two places and
It's very possible that 2 kilometres will not interfere with any pad placement in a development, and it is possible that we can not fully knowing what the layout of the pads may be in any given geography, that we wouldn't know what consequences may flow from that. And I think it would be potentially manageable. The example that we referred to is if, for instance, there's something near surface that prevents you drilling both directions, whether it's some kind of watercourse or sinkhole system in the carbonate limestones or so forth, that you don't want to drill directionally through, or if there is some uncertainty in the location of faults, so you want to set both the directions you're drilling away from and offset from that location, you may go with 2 pads to be more confident about avoiding other risks that are discussed throughout the report, and then of course we're aware of when we do this planning. So in that instance, there may be, and there are exceptional ones we're coming up with, but I guess the point being that if it's a strong recommendation and you must show strong cause as to why you would ever not comply with it, then you would be able to make a case to say, well, in this instance, the overall risk mitigation is most effectively done by what we're proposing here, and we don't think, because in this instance it's away from the road, it's unlikely that's occurring also in a place that directly impacts amenity. So you manage the combination of amenity, geohazards, prescription around pad spacing to provide a holistic overall minimal footprint. And so it is very likely to be able to comply with that 2 kilometre without impacting most notion or design developments. But there could be instances where if it was mandated, there's no flexibility, the unintended consequences may be an increased other risk, which was not the original intent of the prescription.
And then your preferred option of having an area-based, could you clarify what would you use as the area? So if we're talking about a X numbers of wells per area, the whole development area, you mean the whole?
Yeah, well, if we take the 2 kilometre spacing, somewhat logically, it sort of defines a 4 square kilometre surface footprint. If it was, you could have one each end of a 2 kilometre that direction and this direction. So if that would be equivalent in my mind, unless you're thinking about it differently, to a 4 square kilometre prescription. That would be would be likely to be more manageable, because we do have an asymmetry to the amount of surface area, or subsurface area to be more specific, that we cover, because our wells will likely drill out to 3 kilometres in a specific direction, but unlikely drill out 3 kilometres in the opposite direction, because that would be a very inefficiently drilled pad. You'd spend a lot of time drilling at a high angle through overburden, not target, so more drilling time, lower productivity, less time in the reservoir for the same amount of surface footprint. So we tend to drill much further in this direction than we do drill out to maximise our overall efficiency of the development. So there's a natural asymmetry. There have been some propositions that it's a spider type, you just go in any direction. It's a very clear bidirectionality of almost all unconventional pads, certainly in the stress environment. We anticipate in the Northern Territory that we have strong bidirectionality to our drilling, and therefore we will have a greater distance in one direction than the orthogonal direction. And so a surface area, which I would assume meets a similar amenity, it avoids over-industrialisation, but it would have a higher density in one direction than another. So that's what we're trying. I'm not sure if that's a clear description, but that was what we're trying to get across.
Yeah, thanks for that. And then my second question is to do with weeds. And so as in your written submission, you expressed some concern about the recommendation of having a dedicated weeds officer. And one of the issues we've discussed and talked about in our report is that weeds are going to be a particular issue for development throughout most of the NT landscapes, because they're so largely undeveloped, so few weeds in them, and there's going to be an awful lot of traffic coming from outside potentially bringing weeds in, and so that's why we've put as a draft recommendation about the need to have a dedicated weeds officer, because the areas are so extensive that unless you have some very intensive monitoring, you're just not going to pick up weeds before they cause a problem. And so in your written submission, you talk about it'd be much better just to leave it to the management plan and have it more objective based. But I just want to ask you, what situations could you imagine where you wouldn't need a dedicated weeds officer to play that role?
Yeah, the specificity of it is possibly maybe just where there's a break between what we consider, because I think it's an absolutely vital thing to be considered. And again, it'll be area dependent. There are some areas where on our permits there are already weed issues that have been there for some years. There's already a lot of cattle traffic, movements, car movements and so forth. It's not an area that's undeveloped. So in some areas it will have a different risk profile than others. We would consider that, basic hygiene around HSE to be the responsibility of every staff member, and particularly when you put on a safety, there is, although we have HSE dedicated officers, every single person is trained and informed about safety considerations to do with our operations. With critical environmental, where it is also very much a climate environment of speaking out about it and making sure you're compliant, trained and know how to be compliant. So I suspect there'd be many people and in their position descriptions would have a responsibility of ensuring compliance with any specific conditions related to weeds. But whether the specificity of having and so maybe it's a second hat on a role as an HSE advisor, or the many roles we would have ensuring compliance with conditions. But it's struck out as a departure from the overall objective-based recommendations around a needing to achieve a goal as to being prescriptive about a role. And so we made specific comment on it because of that level of specificity, not because we disagree with the fundamental principle of ensuring weeds are managed effectively. Is that suitable? Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Ritchie.
Oh, thank you. Look, Mr. Close, I heard you say that where you've not commented specifically on our recommendations, that you either kind of accepted them or would like to wait and see how they might be implemented before commenting. Is that a reasonable interpretation of what you said?
Yeah, that's what we're trying to say.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I take you through just a couple just to just see which category they fall into? Because just to say chapter 11, which are you waiting to see how a specific recommendation like that you be required to get authority certificates is implemented, or would you say you support that?
Sorry, I missed a key element of your question there.
Okay. The question is that there are some recommendations that are very specific. One of them is that the industry be required to get authority certificates for work. Is that one of the recommendations that you feel is kind of you're okay with, or is that one of the ones that you're waiting to see how it might be implemented? My point being, it's a pretty straightforward recommendation.
Yeah, I mean, we do it as a matter of course and don't anticipate changing that. There's a space of, particularly with the NLC and the AAPA, where we think it's most appropriate for the existing bodies that have strong representations to probably provide feedback. We certainly don't have any, we didn't specifically comment on it, we don't have any in principle disagreement with it.
But I guess it's you said that you either accepted or you're waiting.
Yeah,
My question
so that
is really
one,
simple.
no, we're not waiting on further
okay,
policy.
so you're happy. I'm looking just to be able to, as we finalise, to be able to say, I mean, if you say you're okay, I'll write down. And David Close said he's okay with it. So I mean,
the only caveat that I would
clear
like to
about my
disagree
intention with these questions. So.
With our NLC or AAP counterparts, we haven't consulted with them on those specific chapters. Yeah. We would probably defer to them, but we have no internal issue. Yeah,
but I mean, it wouldn't. I mean, this is this is not something that you would be. I mean, it's not. It would be just a requirement for doing something that you're already doing. I'm starting with that one because it's an easy one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Now the next one, which is our recommendation that site features, that Sacred Sites Act be amended to make it clear that it also applies to features that are under the ground. How do you feel about that? Is that we think that's okay, or is that when we're waiting to see how it might be?
Look, and apologies that Stephanie couldn't join us today, and this is certainly never her expertise. Mm-hmm. We have had some conversations with other counterparts. In our experience relating with our traditional owners, there is no anticipation that it stops at the surface. They can, I think there's a communication about a holistic current view of sacred sites. So I don't, as in my observation, there isn't a gap So that would be my comment, that currently traditional owners feel that's the case.
Okay. Is there anything that that you'd like in that chapter then that that you would definitely say you're feeling that has to be kind of we have to wait and see about, and I'd just like to explore what bit of it you would like to see about, or could I say, for instance, that you're pretty comfortable with all the recommendations in that chapter?
Certainly by and large comfortable. We've done a pretty detailed review. We have provided only very recently on Friday a written response, but it is literally 1.5 pages of commentary, mostly discussing it. So there will be a little bit of detail that's required, and there's a little bit of overlap between potentially environmental versus social that we weren't entirely unclear on, but we didn't see any fundamental issues that we're going to submit further detailed responses on at this point.
And on that basis, just to be again clear, you'd be quite comfortable when we're talking out in the consulting communities over the next couple of weeks that I can say we've had Origin Energy before us this week, and that they've said, broadly speaking, that in fact not broadly speaking, quite specifically speaking, that they're comfortable with all the recommendations we've made in that chapter.
Yeah, look, if I can double check my internal notes to make sure I'm not contradicting anything we've put in our submission, because there are a couple of specific comments we've put in there. Okay. And let me come back to you, back to the task force this afternoon with an email to really nail that question.
Okay. No, thank you. You've made it, I think we'd agree that there is a number of our recommendations that could be more broadly applied to other industries. The chair's made it clear that that's beyond our remit to do. Specifically, though, is Origin's support of those recommendations, the ones that you refer to as being more broadly applied, dependent on them being more broadly applied, though?
Look, I don't think so. There's always needs to be a starting point for any sensible reform, and we wouldn't. I think it's, and I think valuing a commodity, which water can be in this kind of sense, is a sensible approach to making sure it's used efficiently and effectively. And as a principle, I think we support that, and in a lot of jurisdictions we already operate under that way. So water is one where, and again for weeds, it would obviously not be achieve our goals of limiting weed transference if only a subset of vehicle movements are caught. So I think there's a large number of very sensible recommendations, particularly relating to protecting the environment or minimising the impacts of any kind of development that have broad application, but recognise your point, it's difficult for you to comment, or impossible for you to comment specifically on that.
I think, again, just to be clear about where, that we've had a number of submissions about the lack of transparency in the way that the gas industry works. It could be read, if it's not clear, that you actually support them in their own right, that you are not, by broadening the application, you're in fact inviting a more broader based opposition, so that you will in effect hide behind a more broad opposition to some of these things. Would that be, I mean, how would you like to respond to that if that gets put to us in community meetings?
Well, I guess a comprehensive approach to water allocation plans seems whether it's sandalwood, and I don't want to call out, create any issues with any particular industry. There are many industries that will use water resources, and all users should be held arguably equally to account to how it is sustainable for that water use to be justified, and the regulator to use that information and distill and communicate that information effectively. So it is certainly with no intent that our use would be obscured by others. Happy for any kind of lump split that makes sense based on experts' best approach to it. Is that?
I know, that's good. I'll put it another way. Okay, that you would be happy for us to assume that you would be a champion of these reforms to other industries. You can accept them and would champion them in the interests of the environment and the Northern Territory community generally.
Well, look, we'd recognise a trade-off that some current water users, if they're not under a water allocation plan,
I'm talking more broadly, but water included
we will champion if it's appropriate in a holistic sense.
If you say if it's appropriate, that is very much that's qualifying it quite massively.
Right.
I think what I'm asking you is we have some very specific recommendations. They're in black and white.
Yep.
You've put to us that you, if you haven't commented on them there, you accept them, unless in certain circumstances they're sort of like devils in the detail. How are they going to be implemented, which we understand.
Yep.
More broadly, you've said to us that that a lot of the recommendations are more general. They would and would be it would actually improve the way the industries are assessed and approved if they're adopted more broadly. My question was, would you champion that approach across the Northern Territory, the Northern Territory government, or is it more likely, and this will be put to you by others, that you will then seek to, in fact, water them down?
So I certainly don't see any reason that Origin would seek to water anything down. If I give me a little bit of latitude just for a second,
Yeah, sure.
why it's difficult, because we have other stakeholders, landholders, traditional owners that may have a different view about what a resource is to them and what they're currently allowed under existing regulations. To champion a total transition to that, because we're okay with it, would be a bit naive of us in terms of a holistic view about what the broader community and stakeholders in the community want. So from a pure E perspective, I don't think there's any qualification required that a sensible allocation of water ensure sustainable yields and recharges are taken into account when allocating water. Given, if there's an unintended consequence to an existing stakeholder, I don't think I'm in a position to put Origin or my own viewpoint or their viewpoint forward to say I would champion against their current interests. I'm not trying to weasel words or caveat, just I don't know what may come from me championing something like that, for instance.
No, I understand that. It was that, but you were the one that put to us that they should be more broadly adopted. And I'm trying to explore the basis of that submission. You could have said to us, we accept them as an industry, and not talked about what might or might not be applicable to others. And seeing that you did, I'm just trying to explore how applicable and how much you would champion that particular approach taken by government.
So as a general, we would certainly be supportive of the general principle applying to ensure the objectives are achieved, and on a case-by-case basis there may be exceptions that warrant extra consideration. It does sound like I'm political answer, which I'm not intending to.
You kind of more broadly, I just think that statement, my feeling, having talked to you in this exchange, is that that it's more probable that you are seeking to expand by talking about it more broadly, you were in fact signalling that it would broaden the opposition to some of these recommendations. That's my feeling.
I think that's a good observation, that there may be opposition to that intent, that it's intended to capture unconventional gas and ensure that that water usage is very carefully monitored and does not impact, but it doesn't. But there are probably existing interests that would suggest it shouldn't expand beyond that. So I think you're right that it could broaden opposition to the recommendation potentially. It could cut both ways.
I think what Dr. Ritchie is trying to say politely, which I'll say bluntly, is that are you trying to basically suggest that any licensing and payment with respect to water should apply to the Northern Territory Cattlemen's Association?
Yeah, it's a difficult. We certainly aren't here to aren't here to create difficulties for other industries if they would consider such a imposition to be a difficulty, and there probably are members that
we are
would
not recommending that. Our remit is only onshore shale.
Yeah. And I think if it does proceed, let's say new industries like sandalwood or expansion of mango into areas where it's not currently existing, so we'd have to apply new water allocations. I'd say at a minimum going forward to preclude, and I know it's not in your remit, but it would not meet our objectives of understanding what sustainable water take is on an annual basis if we're taking such a small overall user. And so we wanted to get it on the record, make it very clear that we don't object to that recommendation, that our usage should be. But as the government read this and take it and consider what, as a consequence, it may mean for other industries, that it should be considered to apply broadly so we get the objective, not simply added regulation that doesn't meet an objective, which I don't think is a overall productivity or environmental protection benefit.
No, okay, thank you.
Dr. Close, different tack. You noted in your presentation today and also in your submission that you've raised concerns about public disclosure of data in particular related to quality assurance and interpretation of the data. And you've requested that as an alternative there be regular and routine reporting data. I do note that in southeast Queensland there's already reporting of data in terms of PM10, 2.5, ozone, nitrogen oxide, carbon dioxide, which is already online.
Yep.
And I presume that Origin is already a participant in providing that data. So I'm wondering why, on one hand, you're involved in online data, and now during the presentation today, you're raising concerns about the disclosure of that data.
Yep. So thanks for the question. I think it is good to elaborate. Certainly in Queensland, in a number of instances, there are large amounts of data that are continuously and publicly disclosed. There's an excellent hydrogeological monitoring network that OGIA reports consistently, and there's a standard format. It's a very efficient process. It works well. Similarly, for a limited number of air quality stations, it's a continuous reporting of a limited subset. So it's certainly not all data. And is it on a 1 second basis or a 1 minute basis or a 1 hour basis? The proposition that it's all real time, continuously just going into the ether could, for the number of parameters we measure for, most of which will not change in 100 years, the pH and so forth. So we can put that out as a 8-bit data point every second and create a volume of data. So I think the objective is to make sure information is available to people that want to be able to observe that data either in real time or on a regular basis. And we absolutely agree with that. My concern will be that all data is continuous and real time creates other propositions about, particularly in a remote area, about getting data out. We have to build an entire, not asking for sympathy around having to build telecommunications infrastructure. I think that's a reasonable expectation, but to how those things would interact. So it's not, again, in the Condamine Seeps example, we have voluntarily put data on the internet available real time about what the level of gas coming out of the river, which is and various other instances. So as a philosophy, very much support transparency. And it is in the detail of exactly how it gets legislated that'll be important, and we're not unintended we're not trying to dump data on people such that they can't do anything with it, and that was intended to be the tack we're taking. Perhaps they haven't communicated it very well.
Thank you for that clarification.
Just picking up a theme that Dr. Ritchie asked you about, so I assume that because there's been no mention in your submission in relation to the recommendations about sort of greater access to justice, in particular open standing provisions and civil enforcement, that you are in favour of those.
Yeah, I think the only comments we made in our submission were that there should be some clear guidelines around timing that would mean that projects aren't indefinitely delayed or vetoed by...
You say vetoed, what do you mean by vetoed?
So if it's not clear to what any kind of time frame to resolve issues, new issues can be raised to create an effective veto by delaying any kind of project sanction or specific activities. So if continuous submissions relating to the MRG and W1H proposition in 2016 were considered, and the government is required to consider each of them as they in turn, would they still be able to provide an approval which meets all the requirements of the legislation? So I think that was our fear, that we may create such a volume of an avenue that a high volume of submissions could derail otherwise valid applications.
We're not talking about submissions, we're talking about the ability of citizens, groups, to challenge decisions made by the government in relation to permits, approvals, licences in court.
Yep.
So you're in favour of that?
There are various viewpoints. I mean, internal discussion, we didn't see any reason to comment specifically on it. So we think that there are positives to allowing that. We think there could be practical challenges to it.
What practical challenges? Bearing in mind that I come from New South Wales, I'm a judge of the Land Environment Court still, and we have open standing. So I'm just curious, what challenges would that present?
And on balance, and I'm not a deep expert in this area to speak to, and I'm happy to try and find the people with knowledge, and we do have people in this space that could speak more detail. And I think on balance, we didn't comment because we do see that overall, in terms of the direction the industry is moving, and that it's likely that will be where we land. And so I don't think we have any reason to make any specific commentary on it. So I guess, yes, on the principle that we generally support, if we haven't commented on it specifically, if and when it was legislated with greater detail, if it maybe it doesn't require legislation, I don't know how that would be enacted as a recommendation or if it's accepted by the courts. I'm beyond my first year law expertise.
With great respect, Dr. Close, there's a lot of ifs, there's a lot of where appropriates, there's a lot of, well, we need to see more detail. I think we're entitled to know, and certainly possibly the Northern Territory is entitled to know exactly where you stand on many of our recommendations. So, again, I'll press you in perhaps in ways that Dr. Ritchie didn't, which is that where you have not specifically commented upon a recommendation in your submissions, can this panel assume that you are otherwise in principle in agreement with them?
I don't think categorically you can assume that, because we don't think that in all instances there's enough detail to know that we should provide specific commentary rebutting some of that recommendation. And I think until they are more fully articulated, we won't be in a position to say that. So there are some clearly specific examples that we've drawn out and submitted in our written submission. It does not mean that all of the other ones we think, if taken word for word as they are, would be overall beneficial to the objectives that I think we have a very shared agreement on objectives, and we don't necessarily know how that brief recommendation, that might be one or two sentences, the detailed legislation that would be required to enact that could take many guises, and without knowing what that would take and what that would practically mean, and it could mean many things in different environments, I think it's really quite difficult to expect us to be able to make detailed comments saying yes, we accept or don't accept. We would have to go through and say we need further information on these, and there are many that we just say accept. We'd be happy to provide you our internal sort of summary of where we just say accept, because there are, as I said, many dozens of those, but not all fall into that category.
We would certainly, if there's a list of at least those you do definitely accept, we would certainly appreciate that.
Okay.
That would be,
That's
as a matter of clarification. This is the first point. The second point is that I've got 3 points. The second point is that, again, we've had lots of presentations now from lots of people, particularly lots of industry people. We've gone to lots of consultations remotely and up and down the spine, where one of the critical things that people talk about is the need for the creation of jobs, local long-term jobs. In Aboriginal communities, in non-Aboriginal communities. We've had lots of great motherhood statements about what a great idea this is from gas companies, but most of the submissions, in fact almost all of the submissions, have been pretty scant on detail, perhaps with the exception of Central Petroleum. We would really like to see some examples of how there can be the creation of jobs and long-term jobs and training opportunities, not just high-level motherhood statements from you, from Centos, from other companies as well. I'm putting that out there on the assumption that others are watching.
Right, yep. So I would comment that I can see why Central have provided a far more substantive and detailed response to that specific question. In the area where our permits are, there are some, what we call, there are locals, but most larger towns are quite some distance away. We haven't done a detailed plan of what it looks like and where employees come from and who drives from where, how many are local based that aren't currently a local population. I'd love to give a more satisfying answer and make some solid forecasts. I think ACEL and
We're not looking even necessarily for forecasts. We just want some examples of some programs that could be implemented, some ideas, some more concrete, something more concrete than, yes, we all agree it's a great idea and that's what we should strive for.
So in our Origin published a sustainability report on an annual basis. Our FY17 sustainability report talks about the directly employed people from the local community, 157 people from the local community, which is 20% of our regionally based workforce. There are a number, I can find out the exact number, a number of apprentices that are being trained through the various regional centres where we have operations. We have Institute regional buy programs, and we are increasing the amount of materials we buy locally so we can report to that, and our sustainability reports will continue to report on those objectives. We have transitioned our workforce from standalone people camps outside of the towns into local towns. Measuring the knock-on impacts to the economy aren't trivial, but we anticipate that they will continue. And we are spending hundreds of millions to over $1 billion each year in totality in southwest Queensland. Certainly hear the request, and we'll talk to colleagues and see if we can come up with some really tactical supporting material.
Thank you.
What you're asking
Just of
for.
illustrations of examples of where, these programs have been implemented, ideas, how this would work, obviously in the Northern Territory context, bearing in mind where this development, if the government lifts a moratorium, might take place. That was the second thing. The third thing is, you said that there was you suggested that the words production license in the report should be replaced because it was ambiguous. That was a term that was deliberately chosen. So how do you say it's ambiguous?
So the production license, is it considered in the way it reads in context? Was it a approval to proceed with some kind of development?
Yes.
Yep.
It's also used in the permit management system as a kind of tenure that we apply for, as distinct from an exploration permit, and it does come with certain rights to apply for production activities, but in and of, we arguably would have sufficient data in our Mudgee W1 area to apply for a production licence, but we would still have all those steps I articulated to go from having a PL, which gives some level of tenure certainty. It gives you a 15-year window to proceed to development, I think is the time frame, instead of a 5-year window under an exploration permit to continue with your E&A activities, and then certain relinquishment requirements under the Act to kick in. So in that sense, we may apply for a production licence if the moratorium is lifted and we have further confidence that that is an area where you would ultimately to propose a production activity, but there would still be many years of processes that we would go through, continuing piloting, continuing to gather data, continue all the commercial arrangements, make sure the project is confident to be economic, social impact assessments, environmental impact statements. So as a noun, production licence is something that we talk about purely as a tenure instrument. We don't talk about it as an approval. And so obviously our advice can be take it for what it is. We just found as I read through it that I wasn't sure if it meant to be that the production licence as a permit instrument should be delayed in being granted until these certain other thresholds are met, or if it's just the approval for a large-scale project that should be delayed until those thresholds are met. So I think most reasonable readers will understand, but in context, those less familiar with Northern Territory tenure operations may find it ambiguous.
Yes, Professor Hart.
I have an initial question relating to the Category 9. You're feeling that that's too prescriptive. When you read out Recommendation 5.3, you did note that we said Category 9 or equivalent. What's wrong with the or equivalent? Does that not cover the situations that you pointed out?
So really the issue with the Category 9, if equivalent simply means that we satisfy the key recommendations that you put in there, which is make sure that surface casing is put beneath your aquifer and the cement tops.
Sure.
I fully agree with that. The Category 9, I think anything over Category 7 or 8 off the top of my head, based on that table, would have had an intermediate casing string in there. So it's really around the notion of having, so if you were targeting something at 1,400 meters versus 2,400 meters, the need for that intermediate casing string changes. So it's just whether the intent was to stipulate that all wells need to have an intermediate casing string, which all Category 9 wells would require, or the main design principle, which is around cement and surface casing.
We might need to clarify that, but my assumption of the or equivalent was that the regulator would take those situations into consideration.
Okay, maybe it's just the way I initially interpreted, but if it's really the crux of it is around the couple of points that you stipulated prior to the Category 9, then Origin fully supports those principles.
Yeah, we were looking for, and that table is very instructive, and we were looking for something that was flagging very, very good codes of practice. So that was the main thing. we'll have a look and see whether that needs to be. The other one was, can I just, a few questions relating to your disagreement, your dislike of closed tanks. I can understand a number of your points, but have you thought about a hybrid system? Yes, there's some advantages in open ponds in the dry season, particularly if you want to get rid of some of that water. Down in your area, it's near enough to 3 metres a year evaporation, so perhaps about 1,500 during the dry season. So there'd be some advantages there, but the wet season is a concern.
So again, it really comes down to what phases we're talking about. So in an exploration phase where we have a one-off well, the number of truck movements alone to bring in the closed tank storage system that is suitable for handling the amount of waters that we need to deal with, I think becomes problematic in an area that's as remote as the Beetaloo is. Once we start moving to a phase, if the Beetaloo ever moves to a phase where there's much more fixed infrastructure, hybrid systems become a much more viable place. It's just when we're dealing with one-off wells, some of those systems will lead to other risks. If we're trying to, at the same time, trying to minimize truck movements to a site, how do we balance those two risks and considerations? So different systems have their different advantages. I wouldn't be surprised if sometime in the future we are using a mix of systems, but early on during the exploration phase, I think when you also consider the number of ponds that we would have on a well site that we were stimulating in the exploration phase. Initially, you'd have the entirety of the water that you need, which would be fresh water stored in those ponds. By the time we're done our operation, if we've planned out everything correctly, we should have used all our fresh water. We're going to have the storage on site will be much, much, much greater than the amount of water that we expect to get returned from flowback. So the ability for us over short periods of time during a production test, during exploration, to manage the water levels in these ponds should be relatively straightforward. The amount of freeboard that we should have in any of these ponds should be great, because we should only be recovering over the course of a test anywhere between 20 to 40, at this point in time, we would expect between 20 and 40% of the total volume that we would have initially pumped. Making the distinction between exploration and then the whole fracking operation for a pad, 10 wells, etc., etc. I still can't get my head around what the wastewater management system would look like there, because that's going to occur over 10 wells, at least a year, so probably more.
The fracture stimulation period would be smaller, because you'll be doing just on the period before we handle it. It would be not a single operation at that point, because you're on a pad. You can be using your fracture stimulation equipment far more efficiently, and fracture stimulating multiple wells, getting far more stages per day. So I wouldn't anticipate the fracturing, if it was a 10 well pad, to take a year. It would be a matter of 1 to 3 months.
Yeah, so I did note that
for 10.
Yeah, North America chiefs.
So I did note that in the actual report there was an assumption made by the panel that wells are fracked sequentially. You do one well, and then you move to the next well, and so on. That's not how we conduct our operations, because we will be running wireline in one well bore, and once we're done the wireline operations and finish pumping in a certain well, you begin your pumping operations in the next well on a specific stage while doing the wireline work required to prep the next stage on that well. So you sort of move back. If there's a set of 4 wells that you are stimulating, you'd be starting at well 1, then going to 2, 3, 4, going back to 1, 2, 3, 4. So you sort of go back and forth between the wells. What I can do is there were a few very good articles that were published in the SPE's publication of the Journal of Petroleum Technology recently on how companies there have their holistic wastewater management strategies that they have employed there, which will give you a sense for, they'll have dedicated ponds that are specifically wastewater, how they then allow solids to settle out and reblend with freshwater ponds in order to create the right blend that they require.
And reuse.
Subsequent wells, yes. So I will create a photocopy of that and pass it on, because I believe that may answer some of the
That'd be good, if you could. Appreciate that. Just taking up your point about holistic, I think we asked you some questions previously, and also Santos and Pangaea, about have you guys had any discussions about getting a some sort of, if indeed there's a need for a treatment plant, whether in fact there's some capacity to do a combined treatment plant? Has that gone any further?
Not at this point. I think if the moratorium lifts and the next proponents are able to successfully sort of take the next stage of getting some level of technical certainty, as you go into that detailed project planning phase we talked about earlier, areas where you can collaborate are certainly front of mind to operators for various reasons. There's hard capitalist reasons of efficiencies, and there's also the minimisation of impact. So we meet with other industry colleagues to discuss various matters, but we haven't done in detailed planning on how we would collaborate on project planning. We'll have to see which proponents are proceeding and which area they're proceeding in. If we can co-use infrastructure, it's a very strong case to do so.
Yeah, okay. Just following up... Last one. Yeah, sure. Just following up the sequential, non-sequential nature of a pad, is there any correspondence between pad 1, pad 2, pad 3, pad 4, or are they all separate?
The pads themselves will more or less, they'll be separate, so you won't...
So there's no interchange of water, wastewater?
Unless you had multiple, a frac spread will only be on one pad and will stay on that pad until it's done. Okay. What you would, some areas, and again, don't know what the best area for, the best strategy for the Beetaloo is of yet, there will be some infrastructure, so quite often your water facilities will be a centralized infrastructure, and you will run pipelines or water lines from the central infrastructure to your pad, which will minimize. So when I believe you would have seen some of the photos at Amungi, and we had to set up a whole bunch of ponds. In a future world, if you're in a development, likely you'd only have one pond to make sure that you had enough water.
You're talking about freshwater pond?
Yeah, so let's say you'd have a freshwater pond you have a single pond that's then fed from your central facility. That is sort of where the future would go. Okay. So there would definitely be the opportunity for shared centralized infrastructure even within a single field.
Thank you.
Yes. Dr. Jones?
A question, I think, to Dr. Close first, about geomechanics. One of our submissions suggested that the US analogues, for example, might not be as good an analogue for the Australian context because of different sorts of stress regimes, and this could severely impact on the efficiency of hydraulic fracturing and hence well spread and density of wells and other things like that. Could you comment on that particular assertion?
Yeah, look, I think we're happy. We speak about it as a technical an element of understanding the overall system is what the stress regime is. And many basins in the US are what we would call a passive basin setting, and it's all to do with the differentiation of vertical stresses versus primary horizontal stresses. And there are stress regimes that are not optimal for hydraulic fracture stimulation, and there are instances in Australia that do have that stress regime.
That was specifically raised in that submission.
We have now data from the Beetaloo Basin, from the wells, from the image logs. That's the data source that we use to get a lot of our stress information that shows we aren't in the type of regime that would not be optimal. It's reverse stress regime is the term that's used. we do not. We now have data, so it's not a do not believe statement. We have data that supports we're in a strike slip to normal stress regime and would anticipate that we could effectively fracture stimulate these wells, and that therefore we would not, for any reason, not be able to efficiently. If it was reverse stress regime, you would probably never proceed to development because you may not be able to create an effective fracture stimulation and reduce gas. So it's a self-correcting mechanism to some extent.
I'd gathered that from my reading of previous publications, but I just wanted to get it from the horse's mouth, as it were, just for implicit clarification.
It's very unlikely you would have had a successful production test because you can still place a job potentially in a reverse stress regime. You might have significantly higher treating pressures and the like, but to be able to produce for the given number of stages that we were able to execute at Mungie. Permeability in shales is very low to begin with. Permeability in shales in vertical directions is essentially non-existent, which means in a reverse stress regime, the majority of your fracture is orientated horizontally, and essentially the productivity would be very, very low in such a circumstance.
It's good to get that reassurance to make sure that we can cover off on that particular submission. Second question is follow-up on category. Clearly, well integrity is a really serious issue for all of us.
Yes.
From the point of view of the potential for environmental contamination. And that was the intent of that recommendation, was essentially for environmental protection. What category wouldn't you go below, for example, in terms of that kind of level of base assurance without local mitigation, things like that?
So again, it really depends on where your target is, but if you take a look at the work that would have been done in that study where that table originally came from in Colorado, I believe if you take a look, the category 6 well is, I believe, the equivalent to the category 9 except without the intermediate casing string. In my mind, that should be the minimum level because that essentially meets the requirement that the panel and Origin has suggested, that we need to make sure that top of cement is above that shallowest hydrocarbon bearing zone. It's very important to also identify where those shallow hydrocarbon bearing zones are and to make sure that we are satisfying the requirement of ensuring that surface casing is set deep enough to properly isolate the potable water aquifers.
Certainly most issues with methane excursion seem to have been not accounting for those shallow hydrocarbon zones, not cementing in the correct zones.
I would agree with that.
Just on the topic of methane, one of our submissions suggested that, okay, we might be saying that methane per se is not that toxic at low concentrations, and I think we can accept that. But if you like, the fly in the ointment that was raised was what is the possibility of methane carrying other volatile organic substances up with it? And so introducing an extra environmental stress that methane itself wouldn't have.
So we have a good database of gas from the Valkyrie formation in particular. It has a very low capacity to carry any other kind of volatiles. It's very much a dry methane gas with a small amount of CO2 and other inerts like nitrogen. We've done very detailed analysis of the gas and flowback fluids and submitted that in our human health risk assessment, and there's no evidence other than what we've included in there that we wouldn't be able to design an appropriate handling system for.
We're particularly concerned about that, about fugitive emissions, in the sense that once it gets to the surface, is it just methane we have to worry about, or even in the groundwater, or is it something that's come up with the methane? We accept that water carrying is not likely to occur, but methane being highly buoyant will certainly carry things, will certainly rise.
Yeah, we haven't seen evidence. I think it is a very mobile gas. Most other, the ability to take any other kind of volatile material is very unlikely, given that there are no other mobile. We see gas production for 30 years plus. We obviously do, if we have solids management, you would know about it in advance. If there was any other material that required processing, it would not be something that would be likely to catch you by surprise.
Well, for example, the analysis of the gas that came up with the production test, could you provide us with some of that trace compositional data just so that we can actually rule off on that one?
Yeah, and we've certainly submitted to the department as part of our submissions, and if we haven't submitted to the panel, we have no reason not to, so we can.
You don't have to do anything, but
course.
We're asking for it. Thank you.
The composition of the fugitive emissions, if there were ever to be any, should be identical to what we're seeing at the separator during a production test.
Yes.
Sure.
Any further questions? Yes, Mr. Priestley.
Yeah, I actually have two questions. One, I guess, relates to your preference for objective-based regulation as opposed to prescriptive regulation, particularly as it relates to setback distances and to the on-site storage of wastewater. The setback distance that we recommended of 1,600 metres was based primarily on evidence from the United States on health impacts around the gas field sites and the distance from those facilities. It seems to me that if you then, it's a balancing act. If you have on-site storage in open ponds, the likelihood of volatile organic substances going off-site is enhanced. If you use evaporation as a management tool, you're then also talking about off-site transport of more concentrated wastewater. So it's a bit of a balancing act in terms of how you estimate those risks. Do you have any comment on that?
A couple of things. Say setback distances may be different for different types of activities. In the US, particularly in some cities, there is a lot of gas processing and gathering that goes on in quite high population areas. So what the appropriate setback distance for a gas processing facility with tens to hundreds of terajoules a day going through it versus a single wellhead may be quite different, and I think that probably needs to be considered. We have observed similar, we've looked at the literature on health impacts, and I think it's certainly an area that needs more study, and we would agree a science-based approach to what an appropriate setback distance is. I think my reading was in the absence of hard data to support what the right distance is, we would go down a path of recommending this, and so more work required. We certainly don't object to the concept of setback distances from areas of population. We are fortunate in many areas of the Northern Territory that it is relatively remote. You are unlikely from an amenity or any other perspective to be limited by setback distances that are pretty reasonable.
Yeah, we've also noted that some of the risk assessments that have been done in Australia, for example, have not always considered some of these off-site pathways to the full extent that they should be, and that's something that we've recommended, and that comes out of the national recommendations as well. The other question I have really relates to the comparisons between coal seam gas industry and the shale gas industry in relation to flare activity. We felt that some of the experience coming out of Queensland, for example, was that some of the health impacts were very likely to be associated with flaring activities. Do you envisage that the flare activities for your industry would be different from that of the CSG?
It is difficult. It would depend on a number of variables: distance to pipelines, degree of success in early exploration, how quickly you can, obviously getting gas in line and into a market where there's a user is your goal, and you do as early as possible. So there could be differences. They could follow a similar path. They're very efficient processes. When we look at the detailed studies into flaring, the efficiencies of modern flare stacks with high dry gas components are remarkably efficient. So we'd certainly be very interested in any evidence that there's contrary health outcomes associated with flaring. As far as I'm aware, we don't have good data or any evidence to support that. But would certainly be interested in looking at that if it exists. So detailed project planning and understanding of the resource will come before we'll be able to do detailed analysis of what percentage of gas might be flared during different phases of the project.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for coming this afternoon, or today, now this afternoon, and we look forward to the receipt of the additional information you've promised.